Fundamentally, humans are social creatures. We're the ultra social creature. We need human interaction like we need water, like that rat, or like that squirrel needs sustenance from its nuts. We desire it so much that it guides our behavior, it drives our emotions. And it also is a huge boon to humans to have that interconnectedness to one another. It enables us to learn from each other's behaviors and then to pursue different paths that might lead us one direction. If we watch one person do something and we can learn from them, say, we don't want that outcome, we're going to do something differently. Humans need social interactions like we need sunshine, recreation. It's a fundamental need for us. Without it, we get sick, we don't thrive. Now, psychology, after the turn of the century, a lot of things happened in the world that really drove changes in psychology. One of those things was, World War I. The introduction of the destructive power and the malevolence that humans had and could impact each other with really changed people's perspectives on human nature. It wasn't until World War II where we saw the atrocities of things like the Holocaust or dropping bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, we saw the full implementation of human malevolence in a war machine with technology. And we were clearly incapable of doing anything about that. We didn't have the efficacy to even control our most malevolent side, the side of us that wants to destroy. This is where we saw a huge shift in human psychology, and that was going for fundamentally, how do we develop ourselves? Developmental psychology became sort of the important side. How do we raise children that aren't going to do this again? That aren't going to set off bombs, that aren't going to enslave, that aren't going to destroy millions of people? How do we do that? And that was the next shift in psychology, called humanism.
Now we're going to be talking about some of the things that people who work in the field of psychology do. As you know, there's not just one thing that psychologists do. For example, I teach, so that's one thing that people who train in psychology can end up doing, is teaching. Most people that end up in the teaching profession are people who are teaching in the K through 12 system in public schools, although there are parochial schools, private schools, charter schools, etc., that also employ people who have studied in the field of psychology and go into education. In the book, it shows a great graphic, and the graphic is sort of a pie chart that shows the differences in what areas of psychology people can study. If you look in the book, you'll find this on page 3, and it shows areas of specialization. That's sort of like which area of psychology you might focus on. For example, I told you that I studied the brain and brain and behavior's relationship. That's called neuropsychology. It's a field in the neurosciences, right? So neurosciences encompass more than just neuropsychology. They encompass things like even molecular biology, chemistry, neurochemistry, neuroendocrinology, neuroimmunology, lots of things in neurosciences. My particular field was neuropsychology, assessing brain damage and potential brain damage, pathology on people's behavior. So we call it cognitive neurotesting. So, and we assess them. We assess their cognitive skill set. That is their ability to use their brain to do things other than the general stuff, like say walking. We assess cognitive skills. Those are the things like thinking, verbalization using language, like mentation, like calculation, memory, problem solving. Those are all areas where neuropsychology focuses. We also, some of us specialize in neuro rehab. What to do about those cognitive problems that people have as a result of neurological injury? How do we compensate for them, or how do we sort of move around them or develop compensatory skills that enable people to thrive in their particular neurological setting? That's only one area of psychology. A lot of people are interested in that because the brain is such a unique thing in the universe. The brain is so cool. When we get into, I think it's in chapter 3, we'll start talking about the brain and its structures, its functions, and its pathologies. But that was just one area. Other areas, and specifically most people, when they begin to think about a career or studying psychology, they think about clinical psychology, right? A lot of people say, well, I want to help somebody. And what they mean by that is not necessarily they want to help somebody build a fence or they want to help somebody do their taxes, because those are all helping people too. But what they're saying is they want to be an individual with another individual or a group that is an aid to their human thriving, to their emotional well-being. And that's the area of clinical psychology. I already spoke about Freud and Jung. They really began this clinical psychology route that had to do with people who are experiencing mental difficulties or mental illness that are not necessarily associated with a neurological illness. Now, I told you that Freud was a neurologist, but one of his famous cases had to do with a woman who had a gloved hand. She had no feeling in her hand whatsoever. And he looked at her neurologically and said, this can't possibly be, you basically have 3 big nerves coming in here that are feeding your hand and taking information away from your hand. So they make your hand move, and then they also sense when you receive some sort of pressure or warmth or other things that your sensory neurons in your hand can feel. And what he as a neurologist knew was she can't possibly have had a gloved injury where above here is numb or has lost sensation unless there's been a massive radical bisection of all those nerves so that there's no communication. And he thought, well, she's experiencing this. She really is. So what could have been the cause of it? And he investigated that it was something to do with an internal conflict in her person, in herself. That's a word that we use, a big garbage can term that basically talks about your experience of the world in and of yourself. Yourself is a product of your mind, or is it? We'll get to that in a bit. But he said her hand wasn't injured from a neurological sense, it was injured from a psychological sense, and that something in her psyche was damaged, and it was injured, and it needed to be repaired. And he even showed that through treatment, through his psychological treatment of her and finding out her issue, I'll tell that story later, she got relief from it. Right? He didn't need to go in and sort of sew back together or something. You can't sew back together nerves. We'll talk about that in chapter 3. But he was able to help her. And that's what most people want to do, is they want to take people who are suffering in a psychological sense, and they want to help them. And that's a really wonderful trait. In fact, when you look at the area of specialization in this book, it'll show you that the chart has about almost 70% of people who are studying psychology really want to be in the helping profession, where they're seeing somebody who's suffering mentally, suffering psychologically, and they want to treat them. Now, even within clinical psychology, you'll see that, like, for me, when I studied clinical psychology in graduate school, I was studying clinical neuropsychology. And that's a different thing than helping people who have psychological illnesses. That's people who have neurological illnesses. Again, identify the sort of deficits and then make compensatory strategies or help them learn to rehabilitate themselves, right? The brain's capable of healing in certain ways, and we'll get there in a bit. But a lot of people want to study clinical psychology because of a deep-seated desire to help. Now, if you're one of those people, don't feel like you're exclusively going to have to do therapy where you sit and talk to somebody about them feeling bad. Some of us aren't good at that. You probably will figure out that I'm not somebody who would have been particularly adept at treating people psychologically. Other areas of specialization are things like industrial organizational, forensic, health, cognitive, social, personality, educational, school, developmental, and biological psychology. All these different subfields have different expertise, different literature, different scientific investigation, different methodologies, but all of them are really aimed at sort of how do we fundamentally study the psychological nature of human behavior with a scientific perspective. We've covered a little bit about science, but science again is the objective measure by which we use hypothesis testing to assess the causal effects of certain variables on human behavior and action. The definition of psychology in the book, which has the scientific study of behavior and mental processes, is a little bit broad and difficult. I like to think of it exclusively as human behavior, because that whole idea of mental processes, we'll see in a second, is a little bit problematic from a scientific standpoint. That's not to say that there's not an important fields of study that cover humans and their psychological well-being from outside of science. Particularly, I think of things like religion has been a big boon for people and their psychological well-being, although we can't study the claims of religion in a scientific sense. It's not like we should repudiate it as it's not scientific, so it can't be good. When something's not scientific, it could be good, but when it's not scientific, we can't utilize the tools of science in order to analyze whether it works or not. So science is limited to the questions it can answer. It has to be something that's observable. It has to be something that we can see. We'll look at some of the things that psychologists mainly do. Those are the small group of people who major in psychology, and then from that small group, there's another smaller group inside that group that then work in the field of psychology. One of the things that people in psychology do is go into government. We have majors like political science, government, international relations, all that have to do with the policies and the procedures and the laws of how people govern one another, how we agree to be governed by one another, how we submit from the state of nature, as Locke would say, into sort of a social contract. Think of Rousseau's social contract of what are we going to give up in our freedoms in order to gain the benefits from social interactions, social relations, social affiliations. And so there are many psychologists that go into government and study the effects of governing on how people behave. This is particularly interesting right now. I know for a fact that many people in the government who have psychological training are really worried about how do they get the messaging out to help people to do the sort of prophylactic things to keep them from spreading viruses and infectious diseases currently. How are we going to utilize what we know about human behavior in order to benefit the group of humans that we're governing? There's also a lot of clinical psychologists that work in the medical field. Now, those could be people that work in, say, outpatient care or in hospitals, like I used to as a neuropsychologist. I'll tell you stories about that in future videos. But those folks work in an outpatient setting, typically in a hospital or in large nursing care facilities, elder care facilities. Psychologists that work in, say, social work, and that's again sort of a quasi combination of both the governmental aspect of it, because social work happens typically in organizations that are funded by the government, and has something to do with healthcare. And those folks deal with folks that have mental illnesses in the community or are dealing with homelessness. And again, the combination of those two is oftentimes prevalent. And then they have people who are psychologists who work in independent practice. It's about a quarter of all psychologists work as independent practice. That's like, let's say you or I were suffering from mental illness or just feeling bad or we, something terrible happened to us. And we felt the need to go and to talk to someone about it because that's a beneficial thing to do. Talk to somebody privately and somebody who has training that can help us weather the storm of life, the slings and arrows of life, or can help us grow potentially from some problems that we're experiencing as individuals. There's also people like me who work in higher education. So professors, researchers, people that have received training in psychology and also are now working to teach people how to do psychology. So there's about 5% of people who do that have training in psychology. Studying psychology is really fun for me because I get to expose a lot of you to the ideas that substantiate some things, some previously held beliefs, and also violate some of the stuff that you think is true about humans. Some of the myths that the book talks about include things like blowing off steam or expressing anger is really good for you. Sure, blowing off steam might seem like it's going to sort of cathartically, like we talked about with Freud, get off your chest some of those uncomfortable things. And yet, when we study this in a setting, in a clinical setting that's doing research where we say, okay, we're going to ascribe one group of people to blowing off steam and the other group, we're going to say, nope, you got to hold in the sort of anger or angst. What we find is that not everything lines up with common sense reality or the sort of things that our grandmothers told us. A couple of critiques of that might be that the methodology we use to assess that might not be good enough to find out what's true for humans. Or, watch this, humans are so complex. Humans are so varied, right? That's the beauty of diversity of humans, is that some of us might need to blow off steam in order for us to behave socially in a way that's appropriate and in a way to improve our thriving. And some of us, when we do that, actually beget more and more anger feelings. So when we look at science, science can answer some questions for us, but it can't tell us what's going to be good for everybody. There's not going to be a system where we just say, everybody do this and everybody will get good outcomes. It's not going to be how it goes. There are other common sense things or misconceptions, previously held conceptions that you might have that are untrue. When we research people in large data sets, we do correlational or we do research studying people's well-beings, we might have conceptions or maybe even fears for ourselves, like when we get to retirement age, life's going to be boring, we're going to be isolated, and nothing's going to be fun. Life will be over at that point. When we actually go out and survey and research about how people are doing in their elderly years, we find that for the most part they're very, very engaged with life, and that they feel satisfaction, and that they look back with pride on their lives, and they're happy to be where they are. I can say from anecdotal evidence, which is not good to use in research to apply to everybody, but just from my perspective, as I age, of course there are things that I find I can't do now that I could do when I was younger. You know, my strength or stamina are both limited now compared to when I was, say, 10 years younger. Yet, I find myself to be happier and happier with each new moment of life. And that has to do with differences not in just age, but in personality and in circumstances. So don't think that one thing's going to be true for all. A lot of times we look at developmental issues, and in the book it talks about this myth that punishment is a great way to change behavior over the long haul. Now, when we get into learning, we'll see that punishment is an effective strategy to change behavior, but the problem is that changing behavior over the long haul does not get the best outcomes when we utilize punishment. In fact, using reinforcement is something we'll see is far superior. If you want to change behavior over the long haul, you need to reinforce that good behavior instead of punishing the bad behavior. That's not to say punishment is something that shouldn't be a part of the toolbox that humans have in order to mitigate or change behavior. What it says is, if you need to change something in the immediate, from a bad behavior to a not bad behavior, punishment might be an effective means. But if you want to develop independence in that person to behave well in the future, you need to find a system and put some parameters around them that reinforce them for good behavior. This makes perfect sense if you consider any of the strategies that we're looking at in changing our world. You hear a lot of advice from people about psychology, and what we'll do is we'll dispel some of that advice and then also shed some light on how humans function. The book uses the example of the myth of playing classical music for babies makes them smarter. You might even have seen some classic music in educational videos like Baby Mozart, Baby Bach. While I love those videos and I definitely watch them with my kids, I didn't expect that those videos were going to somehow increase the IQs of my children or make them better at learning in the future. In fact, what we see is that it's not the actual exposure to the classical music, but it has to do with the fact that parents are involved in their children's learning is a far greater predictor of success and intelligence in children rather than something like exposing them to classical music. Now, classical music's great, classical music's good. I hope you like classical music and utilize it for your own purposes, but it's not something that's going to be a ubiquitous panacea for all the ills of learning and childhood development. It's not going to fix everything. It specifically doesn't have an effect on changing how smart a child turns out to be. So that's something that we hear. You may have even heard, and we'll talk about this when we do development and pregnancy, that some mothers will put earphones on around their abdomen so that it's somehow projecting into the uterus. It's not really doing it that way. Babies don't hear that well in utero. There's a lot of noise inside the body. But that doesn't do anything for the child. It doesn't make the child better or worse. If we say projected nothing or something to the baby via those earphones, we don't see a statistically significant difference in the outcomes for children. Does that mean that mothers shouldn't do that when they're pregnant? I have a neighbor over here, she's pregnant. Should she not play music to her child because science hasn't found that it is an effective strategy for increasing brain development? Well, no. Here's why. The fact that if she did that, she would be considering the outcomes for her child means that she's part of a group that is more caring, more intuitive, more forward thinking about the outcomes that she has now, the behaviors that she has now, and how it's going to affect her child in the future. So again, it's not necessarily the playing of the music, but the playing of the music might be indicative of something else that is good for the child, and that's to have a mother, a parent, a family who's very concerned about their well-being. People have distinctive learning styles. That's the classic one that people talk about. Oh, I'm a visual learner, or I'm an auditory learner. No, you're not. You actually have a fundamental ability to learn. We'll get to that when we talk about intelligence, and Spearman called it G. There are many reasons why you don't have a particular learning style, or you're not a kinesthetic learner, or you're not a hands-on learner. You have comforts, you have personality styles, personality characteristics we can measure, but there isn't something about you that's distinctively only good at learning one way. You might have proclivities or desires, needs, wants, but there's not a particular thing. It's not like you could not learn through hearing if you said you're a visual learner. You could not learn through seeing if you said you were an auditory learner. It has to do with how we spend our time, how we develop ourselves as people, not that there's some sort of inborn structure that then says this person is only a kinesthetic learner and they can't learn auditorily. You may have a desire to learn one way or the other, but when we study this in a clinical setting, we don't find that there are distinctive learning styles. Howard Gardner is the guy who came up with that, and there are reasons that Howard Gardner came up with the idea of multiple intelligences, and we'll talk about that when we cover intelligences. But what you should know is you don't have a particular learning style. You have a learning ability, and how you spend your time developing that learning ability might make you think that you particularly are better at an auditory learner than you are a visual learner. Let's take the example of somebody who grows up out in the middle of nowhere with no Wi-Fi, and all they have are books. They might say, well, I've become, a really important learner through reading alone. And then let's say somebody else grew up in, with Wi-Fi in their house and internet, but they had no books. And they say, well, I'm really a visual auditory learner, right? I can't learn through books. You see that the setting is really what's creating that type of learner in them. Both of those people had an innate learning ability, but then the context that they were in is what guided them towards what they feel like is their innate learning style. Next, I want to talk about anecdotal evidence. What is anecdotal evidence? You hear this all the time, especially when these big contentious issues come up and you're looking on Twitter, somebody goes, I had a bad experience with a cop once, so therefore cops are bad. That's an example of anecdotal evidence. In psychology, in science, we can't use anecdotal evidence. It doesn't mean that it's not important for people to have experienced an individual thing. In fact, you'll hear a lot about people's lived experiences. However, those lived experiences are exclusively valuable to that person in their context for learning. They're not going to be something that's ubiquitously applicable to everyone. When we want to make decisions or we want to make large governmental choices or changes, what we need to do is use evidence that is applicable to everyone. And anecdotal evidence doesn't work. Anecdotal evidence is important to listen to about people's experiences, can give us ideas of what people are experiencing, but it doesn't necessarily tell us what would be true for other groups of people other than that particular individual. In science, we have to use reproducible studies to make decisions about what we say is true or not for humans. A reproducible study is something that if I say, made people eat toast every morning, and I tested their learning, and I said, whoa, the group that got toast, they really excelled in whatever program of study they were in. But the group that didn't eat toast every morning, they failed to succeed as well as the group that ate toast. That would be an objective study of toast's benefit on learning. Now, again, toast, there's no studies that show that toast is somehow really beneficial for your learning, but that's an example of how I would utilize science and methodology, statistics, to say something about toast for everybody, rather than me saying, look, I got my PhD in neuropsychology and I eat toast every morning. You should too. You hear this a lot in advertising because, well, humans learn from each other's experiences. Life's too short to learn from your experiences alone. That's why we have wise people. That's why we have leaders. That's why we have mentors, people that we trust. But oftentimes people use anecdotes. Do what I did and you'll get the same outcome. And we take that to heart. But the problem with that is it's not going to be applicable to everybody. It would be applicable to me. If I did the same things that I did, if I went back in my life and did the same things I did, guess what? I'm going to get the same results. But that's not something that's going to apply to the future. That's not something that's going to apply to more people than just me. And so we want to avoid anecdotal evidence when we're trying to make scientific investigations into human behavior and to see what factors, what variables affect humans' behaviors in different ways. We're going to criticize a lot of research in psychology in here, and that doesn't mean that all research in psychology is bad. What it means is you have to have a healthy level of skepticism when we try to make research or anecdotal things applicable to everybody. We can't make big unilateral statements. People and behaviors are far too complex for that. So we want to be careful about that, and we want to know what the statistics and the studies are showing us and what we can expect in the future. The great thing about statistics is that if we use a good methodology and we use a good data gathering method that's doing what we call utilizing some elements of what's called the central limit theorem. That's the idea if we take a sample of a larger group, that sample is going to give us a perspective that's accurate, or at least semi-accurate, about that larger group of people, that we can make really good recommendations. In fact, we'll see that psychology has made wonderful improvements to human thriving by increasing our understanding of what variables that we shift are going to result in what outcomes later in human behavior. We're not going to touch too much on philosophy, but we are going to consider philosophical contributions towards humans being able to develop a sense of science, to be able to answer the questions. Before science came around, for the Industrial Revolution, people often looked to philosophy and to religion to answer life's basic questions of where do we come from, what do we do. Now, science is definitely supplanted philosophy and religion with answering the questions about life for people, but it hasn't fixed the big questions. And in fact, the big questions are where people got started. It turns out we haven't, over thousands of years, haven't figured out those big questions. Where do we come from, and what is life for? Those might be byproducts of our brain's development, or evolution, as we'll consider in the next coming parts of these lectures. But in reality, science has proven ineffectual at answering those questions,